Welcome to the Sage Thought Leadership Podcast, building experiences that connect, remove friction, and deliver insights. Well, hi everyone, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Ed Kless, and with me today is Nick Huber. Nick is an experienced freelance business journalist and content consultant. He specializes in writing about professional services and business-to-business technology. During his 25-year career, he has reported on some of the world's biggest media organizations, including the BBC, dozens of trade magazines, including Accounting Age, and business publications. As a content strategist specializing in thought leadership, he has ghostwritten blogs, white papers, and opinion articles for top 10 accounting firms, top technology companies, and global consultancies. Welcome to the Sage Thought Leadership Podcast, Nick Huber.
Hi, and thanks for having me.
Well, first off, Nick, why do you do what you do?
Well, it probably all goes back to when I was about 14 or 15. I was at school, obviously, and some reporter from a local newspaper came to give a talk to my class. And I thought it was interesting, and I think journalism had always been in the back of my mind. And then I stayed behind afterwards to ask him a question which was perhaps semi-sensible. And he sort of showed interest and said, if you ever want to sort of learn more about journalism, come into the newsroom. And I'd love to say that I did. And, my journalism career started, but I didn't. I was just too distracted by other things then. But I think that was the seed was planted then. And I really appreciate the journalist coming to give a talk at my school. And then after university, I did politics at university. I did a journalism postgraduate diploma, as a lot of journalists do now, if they don't start in the local media. And I kind of fell into business journalism, really. I originally planned to get into producing TV documentaries, but then discovered that actually there's a lot of work and a lot of variety in business journalism, and it can be very interesting. And then I went through the trade press to the national media. And like a lot of journalists, on the side, I did copywriting, or what's now really more known as sort of content writing, ghostwriting blogs and white papers to earn some money on the side, get on the housing ladder, and discovered that I quite enjoyed it and it was quite interesting. And so now the tables are turned, really. I make most of my income from advising companies on thought leadership and helping them write better quality thought leadership, and also get better media coverage. And then a minority of income from my journalism. That's still very important. But I've probably learned 95% of what I know about writing from the journalism.
So talk a little bit about and expand on what you said there about the quality of thought leadership. You think that it's more varied than it used to be, but the quality hasn't improved much. So talk about why you think that might be.
I think it's because everyone's trying to jump on the bandwagon of thought leadership. Everyone's sort of claiming to be a thought leader these days, even though the term thought leader, it doesn't really make that much sense when you sort of analyze it, but we all get the gist of it. And I think it's a case of sort of companies striving for quantity rather than quality. And there's some sort of common sort of mistakes I see amongst all companies when they're producing blogs or white papers or webinars. And I think one of the main ones is they write for themselves. They're producing content for themselves, but not for the audience. And they're trying to align every single word and sentence in their blog or white paper with their marketing and strategic plan for 5 years, rather than thinking about, right, what's a really interesting idea? How can we write about that clearly and produce stuff that the audience wants to read? And how can we relate that to what our business is doing or our key marketing messages? So that would be one of the common mistakes. Another mistake is to use, which you're probably familiar with and a lot of people listening, but to use too much jargon. I think because sometimes if you use jargon, you don't actually have to think about what you're writing, and it can make you sound, or you think it makes you sound more authoritative, whereas the reverse is true, and it can kind of turn off readers and listeners. Other things, sort of, they're too generic and too vague. rather than focusing on a really specific aspect of a subject. So, for example, say if you're writing about artificial intelligence and how accountants could use it, a generic blog would be, how will AI change accountancy? Whereas a more specific or interesting one, the hook might be, how will small accounting firms specializing in audit use AI to cut their costs and improve efficiency or something?
Yeah, it's really what you're talking about is making sure that you're writing for a particular audience, a target audience, rather than for yourself. And in a lot of cases, that might be a customer, or so you want to put the customer's spin on things. Say what is of value to the person who's going to be reading or using this technology in the end.
Exactly, and I think it's one of the key things that the best companies I see in terms of producing thought leadership, they're able to take a step back from the subject and think, and as good journalists can do or will do, take a step back and think, okay, what's really of interest here? Why would it be of interest to our audience? In journalism, it's often called the kind of the news hook or the so what. You need that to hook the attention of the reader. And when you're producing, I think what some companies don't realize is when they're producing all this thought leadership content, they're not just competing against the direct competitors. They're competing against the traditional media, the new media, podcasts, social media. There's so much, there's a real fight for attention now on so many screens and in so many formats and so many mediums, and probably increasingly it's going to be in the metaverse as well. So that means that you really have to focus on just trying to say something new and interesting for your audience.
So other than obviously your work and trying to improve the folks that you work with, do you see is there a ray of hope in the end? Do you think some companies are coming wise to this at all, or?
I think so. I mean, I think I wouldn't want to sound too pessimistic about the state of thought leadership, but I think the best quality thought leadership out there is better than it was 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. That's a definite trend. And I think probably some of the slickest content comes from either the big four accounting firms. I mean, full disclosure, sometimes I'll ghostwrite content for them, or the big management consultancies. But often what these companies do is they don't just produce a lot of the stuff, the thought leadership in-house. They'll outsource some of the writing or editing to freelance journalists or content marketers with a journalism background. It's hard to do everything yourself, even if you've got a huge marketing department.
And Nick, we have an exit question that we ask all of our guests, and that is, who is a hero of yours and why are they a hero? Okay,
well, that's a good question. And in the back and forth about this podcast, I've been thinking about that question for a long time. And I think my answer would be, I don't have necessarily specific heroes, but if I could give an answer as there's lots of sort of journalists I admire and journalists who've had a huge impact on my life and who I really respect. And it's probably the same for a lot of people listening to this. It might be a news anchor or a reporter for a newspaper who you admire and who's there throughout the big events, the big news stories, and sometimes the big events in your life, trying to explain the world a little bit better, who you sort of develop a trust in, who will ask the really difficult questions to politicians, to business leaders. And I think that's who I'd probably say are my kind of heroes, or certainly people I have a lot of respect for. And even now, you get lots of journalists and the traditional media who are kind of sometimes under attack or under siege, often from conspiracy theorists or populist politicians, or journalists such as, the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, currently imprisoned in Russia. And these journalists face a lot of problems or even, risk to life just for doing their job. So that's the kind of thing that inspires me. And I think there's lots of lessons that can be learned from the best of traditional media, and all those lessons about how they communicate, how they gather news, how they find a news hook or a frame for a story, and how they explain complex things in an accessible way. All of those rules and principles can be applied to thought leadership. I don't think it's actually, thought leadership is really complex. You don't need all these matrices or whatever, but it is hard to do well.
And lastly, Nick, how can somebody contact you?
Probably the best way is through LinkedIn, and I've got my contact details on there. I've got a website. I probably should say it's a website in progress, nickhuberwrites.com. They can also contact me through that.
All right. Nick Huber, thanks so much for being a guest on the Sage Thought Leadership Podcast.
Thank you.
Review and subscribe by searching your podcast player of choice for Sage Thought Leadership Podcast.